Finally, I'm here to tackle the much requested front mission. Front mission has become a difficult beast to tackle as the decades have rolled on since its Japanese only Super Famicom release. In North America, the first game we got our hands on was actually the third mainline entry. English-speaking gamers weren't even granted a Final Fantasy 3/6 style renaming scheme. Nope, pre-Enix merger Square didn't care. They simply dropped Front Mission 3 on our laps, with only a localization of the in-game text to provide any sense of understanding about the story. But this isn't exactly the worst thing Square has done with the series. As we all know, both Evolved and Left Alive do exist. Front Mission 3 was, regardless, a great game at the very least. Sadly, there were some things that were also going to be missed by giving North America only the series' third entry. By that point in the world story, the series had built up a considerable history. A deep well of lore had already been established, entire events and conflicts that most players wouldn't even realize existed until the internet became a commonplace. That's where a rather amazing group of people, with talents far surpassing my own, stepped in to provide much needed translations. These people were and are aptly named the Front Mission Translation Team, and they certainly accomplished what they had set out to do. In fact, their translation predates the Japanese-only Front Mission first re-released by 2 years. Of course, it's difficult to talk about that sort of thing on YouTube though, when it inevitably requires mentioning certain nautical activities. But without those efforts, if you were a purely English-speaking player, just by sheer circumstance as I am, you'd be completely left in the dark when trying to explore the broader series through purely legitimate means. So hats off to them. Officially, we wouldn't receive the original game until 12 years after its Super Famicom debut. That release came in the form of a relatively quiet Nintendo DS remake, itself based on Front Mission First, a Japan-only remake for the PlayStation. I had only ever heard of the DS version by sheer chance, spotting it in a pawn shop nearly 5 years after its release, and at the time, I was a huge gamer. Buying whatever magazines I could get my hands on, amassing a collection across multiple systems, most of which I'd never actually get around to playing. Then again, the DS wasn't exactly something I took seriously at that time either. Front Mission 4 suffered a similar fate with me. I ended up buying it at that same pawn shop years later, and well, we all know where things eventually led for us English speakers. Front Mission Evolved and Left Alive. I've already made entire videos detailing most of my thoughts on those, so after you've watched this one in full, since you know as well as I do that it helps support the channel the most, maybe check those out if you haven't already. And if you end up enjoying this video and want to see more, consider liking and subscribing. I try to post videos almost every week, barring any major life events. So you might be wondering where to start with all of this, or maybe you should at least be. This is where that difficult beast I mentioned earlier comes into play. The very first Front Mission game exists across multiple releases: Super Famicom, PlayStation, Nintendo DS, current modern consoles, and PC. It may be controversial to say, and I know the gaming purists are going to hate me for this, but if you're playing purely for the lore and story, I wouldn't suggest the Super Famicom version, even if you do speak Japanese. It's a curiosity, no doubt, featuring beautiful art and clever gameplay, but the very first version of Front Mission lacks some debatably vital elements. You see, every version after the original is expanded, containing an additional scenario that significantly enhances the story and introduces the characters Daryl Trumbull and Billy Renges, whose names I'm likely massacring. Both of these characters later connect to Front Mission 4. Since these are heavily story-based games and you're likely playing this entry to experience the series from the beginning, I wouldn't recommend the version with less story. There are also some script differences between versions. Other differences are mostly graphical, with Front Mission First Remake adopting a fully 3D style. That version also features a few tweaks, such as multiple camera options, faster battle settings, and an overwhelming number of difficulty levels to choose from. It even includes a co-op Mercenaries mode, which, if I have to be honest, came pretty late into the game's life cycle and didn't get that much attention at all, even with it being a free content update. For the sake of completion, I'll be taking a look at it later in this video, but I can't promise it'll be that thorough. This version is also the most readily available, and the one I just paid money for to make this video, so the vast majority of my gameplay footage is going to come from that release, though not entirely. If you've heard some complaints about how the performance was, they were at some point likely true. Personally, I didn't experience any issues due to playing Front Mission First Remake so far after its release. It did have the luxury of updates to fix further issues, with one literally being released as I was writing this script, so the vast majority of issues have been ironed out over time. It's also important to note that this was not a Square Enix release, but instead developed and published by Forever Entertainment. Apparently, Square Enix really had no care for repairing the franchise on their own terms, and opted for making a few dollars by licensing the series out to those who are willing to tackle it. Then again, these companies don't really care about things like the history or integrity of a franchise, they just want the money from the product. Being a vintage Square title, Front Mission is expectedly built around a story that will take you roughly 15 to 20 hours to complete, depending on what difficulty or accessibility features you're using. Then again, those aren't present in the original versions. It's entirely possible to shorten that playtime by enabling options that speed up movement or bypass combat animations, so long as you're playing the recent remake or even the DS version. Conversely, you could also slow things down to a crawl if you prefer just a dash of realism. For me, I played through the game at a regular pace, aka default. I wanted to see all the combat animations and mech designs in action, but without it taking a year of my life to get through. Of course, this playtime increases if you include the USN scenario, something I can't really imagine skipping. The newer version also includes a New Game Plus mode, which could add even more hours to the experience. The game's main scenario centers around Royd, who likely was meant to be Lloyd at some point, but as I've learned, the Japanese often use R in place of L, so things like this do happen. Trust me, I was made painfully aware of this in the comments section of my Frame Grab video, where I learned that the game was likely meant to be called Flame Glide. He is part of a world where Wanzers exist, which are essentially mechs derived from the idea of tanks. This can be gathered by their name, with the word Wanzer being a truncated version of the German Wanderpanzer, meaning walking tank, which is something I found really clever. As the series goes on, the Wanzers become more advanced and evolve as both war machines and industrial tools. However, they're never really painted as the turning point for society in conflict, not like, say, something like the iconography that starts surrounding the RX-78 in Mobile Suit Gundam. Rather tragically, Royd finds himself used as a pawn by political forces to instigate a second conflict on Huffman Island, a large landmass formed by volcanic activity, now contested by world powers. At the start of the game, he's a member of the Oceania Cooperative Union, or OCU, an alliance that includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. After a previous conflict with the USN, a political and military union of North and South American nations, Huffman Island has been divided, with tensions simmering just below the surface. Royd and his squad are ordered to investigate a USN munitions factory, but the mission quickly goes sideways. They're ambushed, and among the attackers is Driscoll, a USN ace pilot. In the chaos, Driscoll destroys one of the team's Wanzers, which just happens to contain Roy's fiancée, Karen, and she's presumed dead. But things spiral even further. The munitions factory is set off, triggering a massive explosion that reignites full-scale war over Huffman Island. Suspiciously, the OCU lists even the surviving members of Royd's squad as KIA. Now, left grief-stricken and guilt-ridden, not just over Karen's death, but over the knowledge that he played a direct role in the renewed conflict, Royd falls into a downward spiral. A year later, he's risking his life in the arena for cash when Gary Olsen offers him a new path, joining the Canyon Crows, a mercenary unit working under the OCU's command. What follows is, admittedly, a bit of a meandering narrative. For a good stretch, the story lacks clear direction. Royd spends most of his time chasing vague leads about Karen's possible survival, while being pulled into one job after another by a revolving door of characters, most of whom are more interested in making a profit than anything resembling morality, which is interesting, but has a habit of derailing the game's rather loose plot at times. For a while, it feels like the game itself isn't quite sure where it's going. It wouldn't be too surprising if
Toshiro Tsuchida,
the game's lead scenario writer for most of the 3 Front Mission games, might have had a hard time writing a narrative that allowed for a sizable amount of gameplay, or simply added a few of the more meaningless encounters just to try and pace out the game. Truthfully, outside of Royd, Olsen, Natalie, and Mehua, most of the cast doesn't seem particularly relevant during the game's first half. There were plenty of moments where I caught myself wondering what exactly I was doing and when something significant was actually going to happen, and really a little bored with what was going on. It also felt like those instances where you could go into bars to talk to the locals about what's going on in the world, similar to what was done in Mech on the SENS, were a little pointless, as they never seemed to say much beyond the obvious. That and it just added another menu to a game with lots of menus. Thankfully, when the second half kicks in, it does kick in hard. Suddenly, the game explodes with political intrigue, shifting alliances, and a military sci-fi twist that recontextualizes everything from the first half, finally making it all click. So midway through, multiple new factions enter the fray. The OCU becomes close to securing victory over the USN, but their efforts are cut short when the Peace Mediation Organization, the PMO, steps in and successfully brokers a ceasefire. Backing them is the Republic of Zaftra, a name you'll hear a lot as they remain a highly antagonistic force throughout the Front Mission series. With the PMO now exerting a control over the Canyon Crows, Royd suddenly finds himself unable to pursue his own mission. Even when he comes face to face with Driscoll, the man responsible for Karen's death, he's forced to weigh his personal revenge against the risk of escalating the war yet again. Unexpectedly, even side characters like Ryuji start playing into the larger narrative in ways that feel entirely organic. His family became major players in some of the game's deeper story revelations. What's the secret behind Nirvana and its experiments? Well, I'm going to say it's certainly worth playing to figure that out. That is, especially if you're wanting Metal Gear Solid-esque plot revelations with your mech RPG fix. The game's USN scenario acts as a prequel of sorts, putting you in the role of Kevin Greenfield, a USN officer before the main game's fateful munitions factory incident. Much like Royd, Kevin is a flawed character navigating the chaos around him. His biggest mistake? Making the USN look bad, something that puts him at direct odds with their plans. He crosses paths with Royd, Karen, and Ryuji at one point, but the encounter is anything but meaningful. Instead, this campaign gives a more personal look at figures like Driscoll, mainly just cementing his righteous attitude towards war scenarios. If anything, this is where Driscoll really solidifies himself as a Char sort of character. He's got the presence and the unwavering ideals that define that archetype, though it certainly doesn't match in terms of charisma. He technically replaces Olsen in this scenario, his presence feeling more like an extended cameo than anything substantial. Ultimately, Kevin's story mainly serves to add extra layers to the revelations seen in the later hours of the main story rather than stand on its own, which is likely intentional as to avoid many potential plot holes as possible. It's also far more thematic, with writing that feels more in line with later Front Mission games. Characters stand out more and have a lot more personality, with interactions that bring them far closer than anything seen when it comes to Royd's side of things. But that makes sense, this scenario wasn't part of the original release. It was written years later after the series had already found its footing, with the first versions dropping as late as 2003, which was just wild considering this was an original PlayStation game from Square Enix at a time when the system was basically a pawnshop exclusive. On the other hand, it did also manage to bring one of Square's more unique games over to a platform it practically dominated, and which also conveniently was also able to be played on the practically new PlayStation 2 thanks to backwards compatibility. This is also probably why we never got Front Mission First's PS1 version in North America. By 2003, the PlayStation was beyond dead over here. This was before the collector's market artificially inflated the value of anything remotely old. It's not like today, where if Square Enix suddenly announced a PS1 exclusive release, you'd see articles praising it as some lost masterpiece while people scrambled to secure a copy. No, in 2003, people would have just shrugged and asked, why even bother, the PS2 exists. That said, this scenario isn't just some DLC before DLC was a thing situation. It's not some throwaway side story, it's a full-fledged campaign that takes a good chunk of time to get through. Now, I've played every version of this game available in English. Long before the remake, before I even knew about the PS1 versions or that the DS release included the USN scenario, I played the original Super Famicom version. Even today, it's an impressive title, a sadly deeply forgotten part of a library filled with games that accomplished a lot with very little space. But my point is, I have a solid basis for comparison when looking at the original and the remake, especially since I replayed a lot of these versions for the review you're watching now. So, To tackle the immediate elephant in the room, Forever Entertainment's Remake is surprisingly faithful to the original's gameplay, and so is the North American DS port of First. So most of what I say here applies across all versions. Actually, scratch that, it applies to all versions. The biggest differences you're getting are, as I said, graphical updates and accessibility features. At its core, no matter the version, this is a simple, straightforward tactical RPG where you pilot customizable mechs called Wanzers to complete missions. Dozens of new Wanzer parts and weapons become available throughout the game, allowing for a lot of customization, both in looks and functionality. You can swap out head, body, legs, and 2 separate arm types at any time. Of course, not all parts are created equal. You'll need to decide how to specialize each unit, balancing mobility, firepower, and defense to fit your playstyle. That said, it's not as heavy-handed as you might think. Square once had a real knack for making straightforward RPG systems that just worked, where the biggest complexity came down to preparation. And in this case, preparation doesn't mean grinding, it mostly just means cash. There's an arena mode where you can grind money, but beyond that, there's no traditional grinding since you can't replay missions. The game does give sort of an impression of exploration with a world map and multiple locations, but in reality it's a linear experience. Every Wanzer can equip 2 shoulder-mounted weapons, governed by the long stat, and 2 handheld weapons which are affected by the short and melee stats. Even though you get access to machine guns, rifles, shotguns, and the like, all of them count as short unless you're using a grenade launcher or a bazooka. This means that most weapons require you to be directly in front of an enemy to attack. For machine guns and shotguns, that makes sense, but for rifles, yeah, that one's a bit questionable. You'd expect them to have an actual range, but the most important distinction between weapons isn't their type, it's whether they fire in single shot or burst. And after suffering through the first half of the game using rifles, I can tell you right now, machine guns and shotguns are absolutely the way to go. As this game progresses, you'll unlock a lot more skills that complement those over rifles. For a good chunk of the game, Wanzer pilots lean into the whole walking tank motif, but eventually they start to look downright futuristic. By the later missions, you're piecing together units that seem way beyond the technology level established earlier on, but since you never really see the outside world at any point, it's passable. Some parts seem useless at first, but once you realize that a pilot's role determines how their skills develop, the seemingly odd stat discrepancies start to make sense. Now in theory, you could load up every unit with an arsenal of high-powered rifles and long-range missiles, but as I quickly learned, that actually messes with the game's skill system. Unlike traditional RPGs where skills are tied to leveling, here they're based on weapon usage. The more a pilot uses a specific weapon type, the more skills they unlock for it. You'll still gain some skills over time, but if you constantly swap weapon types, your pilots won't develop enough proficiency or get the good ones. Thankfully, the skill system isn't actually too deep here, so in actuality there aren't that many skills to really worry about, and most are versatile against different weapon types since they're tied to the long, short, and melee stats. So lack of focus won't hurt you as much as it would something like Front Mission 3, but it could still mess things up. Of course, every part of a Wanzer is also destroyable, which can turn some battles completely on their heads when an arm carrying a vital weapon or the legs of a Wanzer suddenly get destroyed, leaving a unit practically useless. But the biggest thing about Front Mission's gameplay, it's just a dice roll. Think Super Robot Wars, where every attack is tied to a percentage chance. This game doesn't tell you what that percentage is or what the assistive stats from things like CPUs actually do. You'd probably need a hex editor to really break that down, or play this game for an unreasonably long time. No matter how much strategic planning you think you're doing, there's always a random chance that an attack just isn't going to land. And honestly, it has to be that way, otherwise whoever had the highest damage weapon would just win by default. It's important to remember that this was originally a Super Famicom game, meaning there was a lot of limitations. The randomness of combat was likely the only real way to capture that real robot feel in a turn-based system. For its time, it works great. But if you're coming in expecting modern refinements, or the more complete combat system seen in Front Mission 3, 4, or 5, you're not getting that here. Another attempt to add a bit more strategy and realism to the game is by introducing an infield truck that can be used to resupply missiles and health items, which actually added a pretty interesting twist to the game as time went on. There are also limits on how many units you can take into a mission, and you'll amass a pretty decent size of party members as the game goes on. However, since the game is linear and you can't actually really grind out some of the lesser characters the game provides you with, not unless you spent way too much time in the arena, naturally you'll end up focusing on a handful of members, and having a load of useless ones you can't afford to use for the most part. That is, until the game flips that on your head. A vital part of the plot I can't really mention without giving, spoilers. Some really odd difficulty spikes do exist as well. A few early missions feel unreasonably tough. Even on the standard difficulty in the remake, I was getting destroyed in the opening chapters. Then suddenly, everything got much easier. Missions can also drag on a bit, since Wanzers take a while to traverse the battlefield. Forever's Remake adds a lot of quality of life options to speed things up and make the game a touch more playable for modern audiences without encroaching on the original gameplay. All of this is able to be disabled at any point if you don't like it. For this video, I gave the free Mercenaries mode a shot, the one added in an update after Front Mission First Remake's initial release. I'm sure some people will get a kick out of it, but for me, there just wasn't much to write home about. You pick from a roster of preset characters, complete skirmishes against enemy forces, and unlock more maps as you go. That's about it. One of the first things that stuck out to me was how completely detached the character designs feel from the Front Mission world. There are zero attempts to keep in line with or emulate Yoshitaka Amano's original artistic direction for the portraits, and since there's no story to flesh these characters out, they're reduced to being defined by their quips and whatever canned dialogue they have to say when you select them. A few very simple additions would have gone a long way in making this mode more worthwhile, like letting characters level up and gain skills over time, or better yet, allowing players to earn cash and build up a custom Wanzer using the same systems from the main game, but none of that's here. And honestly, that's a bit baffling. This mode is clearly focused on its co-op functionality, yet it doesn't give players much incentive to actually engage with it. Not letting players develop their own unit or progress meaningfully really limits the appeal. That said, it is also just a free bonus, so at the very least there's that. When it comes to graphics, I'm always going to put the Super Famicom version above anything else that came after. Sure, later releases for the PS1 sharpened things up, and there are some nice improvements here and there in the 3D remake, but they're all built off something that was already solid. No version ever strays too far from that Super Famicom original, and it holds up so well that plenty of people skip the added campaign entirely and just play this version instead. That said, I still wouldn't recommend it off the bat if you are looking for the full Front Mission world building experience, but if that doesn't matter to you, well, it's your choice. Personally, I found a lot about this version more visually appealing. It has a grittier feel compared to Front Mission First Remake, which leans a bit too clean. The UI, for example, has a sharper, more distinct font that feels unique to this game, and it uses a sepia color scheme that gives everything a rugged, tanky look. It really complements the whole worn-out war tone that the game is going for. I also prefer how the world map was handled. The newest version is just a static image, whereas the Super Famicom version actually creates an illusion of depth. Moving between locations also looks better here. There's clearly more effort put into making traversal at least somewhat visually interesting, and really I didn't get that with the 3D remake. The DS remake feels like a really squashed version of the Super Famicom original, almost like it was more something originally envisioned for the Game Boy Advance. Officially, it's a port for the PS1's Japanese exclusive Front Mission First, but honestly, a lot of the more mobile-friendly sprite work and UI choices feel like they were pulled more from the WonderSwan version than anything. To make it special, most of the map traversal happens on the bottom of the screen, with the stylus used for movement and action selection. The top screen meanwhile shows combat as it happens, while the bottom screen just kind of sits there. Sometimes it displays terrain information, but most of the time it's just a very ugly, mostly white screen with a faint logo. That logo really threw me off for some reason. I genuinely thought it was a glitch at first. It just didn't feel right, and the way the sprites just idle at the bottom of the screen while combat plays out above, it feels lazy. Why not put the action up top and display damage stats and experience gains at the bottom instead? Now, Front Mission First Remake is, first and foremost, a Nintendo Switch game. It was designed around that system's capabilities, built with 720 and 1080p resolutions in mind. I personally played it on an ultra-wide monitor with a PC about 10,000 times more powerful than the Switch, but all that really amounted to was some extra screen space. The Wanzers still look exactly the same as they do in the Switch, and the weather effects, while not outright bad, show their age due to the game being built to run on a custom NVIDIA Tegra chip. But I've covered plenty of games on this channel that don't chase AAA graphics, just solid gameplay experiences, so fidelity doesn't matter much to me as long as it fits the game itself. That said, there are some visual choices I wasn't a fan of. The UI is way too clean. Gone is that chunky sepia text box style, replaced with something a little too slick for my taste. The backgrounds are well animated and add some movement to the world, but they also clean things up a bit too much. That rugged, worn-out war aesthetic is softened, and that might be what's dividing some opinions on this version. Some of the animations are also a little bit odd, like the goofy mist animation, which looks like a Wanzer pilot just got a little too twitchy with the controls, but there's nothing too egregious, unless of course you're a fan of the original's fixed camera angle, where the player was positioned in the lower right of the screen and getting fired down upon. That's been completely changed here, even though it was still present in the DS version. Of course, Yoshitaka Amano, who at this point should need no introduction, did the original concept designs. He didn't contribute much to the in-game art, so there wasn't a whole lot of that needed to be carried over. That said, the character portraits he originally designed seem to still be here in an enhanced form, and they've been really well done, unlike Mercenaries mode. I can't tell if they've been upscaled and touched up or fully redrawn, but either way, they're spot on with the Super Famicom original, so at the very least, there's that. The soundtrack here was done by Yoko Shinomura and while there are some whatever tracks here and there, Front Mission happens to be one of Square's more notable early soundtracks, outside of Final Fantasy titles. Shinomura worked on a host of memorable games before Front Mission, from Final Fight and Street Fighter to Breath of Fire and Live Alive, and a lot of that influence can be seen here. As I'm mostly familiar with the work of Square's more famous celebrity composer, Nobuo Uematsu, it was nice to hear the capabilities of other musical talents at the time. Noriko Matsueda made her debut as a video game music composer and arranger here, so her contributions are entirely fresh. Shimomura would go on to become as deserving of fame as Uematsu. Matsueda wouldn't find the same level of fame, but would contribute to titles such as the second Front Mission, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy X2. While her jazzy style was notable in the industry, she simply didn't do much beyond her work on X2. Though maybe she should. Because of these two talents, the battle theme of this game will never stop being an intrusive thought. The DS and 3D Remake soundtracks seem to keep everything intact, and while I know they have some enhancements to make things seem better on the hardware they were designed for, I didn't really notice any changes that made things heavily different, so I really don't have too much to say about that. Now, I refer to Front Mission as Square Enix's most maligned series for a reason. While there are certainly other games that deserve attention and should be brought out, Front Mission has a clearly defined fanbase that still has not let go of the series. There was enough demand to justify several remakes of the original game and the sequels. I mean, I'm a nothing YouTuber, and my video on what is arguably the worst game in the series, Left Alive, broke 50k views in a week. Front Mission has so many titles that haven't come here, but people still have an interest in them so strong that it defies language barriers and bypasses disasters like that game and Front Mission Evolved. Square Enix, though I'll admit they still release games that I personally enjoy, has all but reduced the Front Mission universe itself to a name and story that can be licensed out to whoever pays enough money. In all likelihood, part of this comes down to the series' origins. Front Mission wasn't initially a Squaresoft only game, it was a collaboration with G-Craft, a smaller studio of passionate developers who would go on to be big names in the industry but weren't there yet. What made Front Mission special was that it felt like something different from the company's usual output. The project had room to breathe, with people like Shinji Hashimoto and Toshiro Tsushida brainstorming ideas back and forth out of sheer excitement for the project. Even Hironobu Sakiguchi, who already had the clout from Final Fantasy, was invested in the project simply because he loved robots. That passion bled into every corner of the game. The team pushed for an immersive experience by scrapping the typical Squaresoft logo at the start, something that was unheard of at the time. They even created an entire sample movie from the intro on a Macintosh just to sell their vision to producers. Kao Yokiyama, whose modeling work was already renowned, was brought in to make the Wanzers feel like tangible machines, not just designs on paper. Sure, Yoshitaka Amano's concept was a little rough, not quite at the level of his later work, but that imperfection is what makes the whole thing feel human. That human quality is what Squaresoft seems to have lost over the years. Franchises like Mech were always just licenses, and people expected that. Different developers, different spins on the same thing. But Front Mission always stood out because it was a world that felt like it had been built from the ground up by people who believed in it. As soon as the series started getting passed off to underexperienced studios with Front Mission Evolved and Left Alive, that vision got diluted. Square Enix seemed to think that throwing money at graphics and sound would somehow make better games, all while stripping away what made the series work in the first place. All they would have to do is stay true to the technical roots of the originals or follow in the footsteps of other spin-offs like Gun Hazard or Alternative. But instead, we've been getting games made by people who don't fully understand the series or its tone. You can even see that disconnect somewhat in the Forever Entertainment remakes. Little things like bland color scheme changes and the lack of those world map flourishes that made the menus feel alive. Front Mission is not about the Wanzers entirely, it's a sum of thematic, visual, and musical elements that come together to form a feeling that drives and connects everything. As of writing this script, I have not really played the Front Mission 2 remake, but you can bet that will be tackled this year. We'll have to see together if things take a turn here. And as I'll probably pre-order it, we'll see if people's fears about the Front Mission 3 remake come to light. We don't know yet, I don't know yet, but soon we'll both find out. I've been Kei-Nova, and if you've made it this far, please type Prosper in the comments section below. Why? Because it sounds cool. Hopefully, if enough of you do it, this channel will prosper, and many good things will come for both of us in time. That being content for you, and opportunities that will allow me to make more of that very content. I hope you're all staying safe, and thank you for watching this video to the very end.